Thank you for coming and to listening to us give our presentations. So the paper that I'm discussing today is on the topic of currency warfare, which I define as the use of monetary or military force for purposes of undermining the preferred monetary value of an enemy's currency. And I'm going to be looking at 3 cases today in which currency warfare was implemented, or at least considered rather, through the counterfeiting weapons, currency counterfeiting weapon. And the research question that I have here is, when and why do states consider implementing currency warfare? And this is based off of my own dissertation and then ongoing research of the last few years, which was largely motivated by this picture over here. And what this is back in 2016, there began to be news reports of airstrikes on these cash storage sites in northern Iraq and Syria, which the media labeled ISIS banks, cash storage centers is what the US military called them. And sort of the news coverage at the time was that, hey, this is really unusual. Sorry. I've never had so many microphones. Anyway, that this is rather unusual, that these are relatively rare events, that currencies and monetary power aren't usually weaponized. Usually if they are, they're part of sort of a coercive diplomatic effort, but not necessarily as a target or a tool of war. And so what motivated me to begin to look into that was to say, well, is this actually true, right? Is this actually that rare? And what I found is that although bombing currencies from the air is a little unusual, currency warfare and targeting an enemy's monetary power is not. In fact, I've been able to find 35 wars and conflicts since the mid-1700s, which has experienced currency warfare through any number of monetary weapons, whether it's counterfeiting currency, the introduction of fiat or paper currency, foreign exchange manipulation, currency refusion and currency repudiation, and then also airstrikes, not just by the US against ISIS, but also by the Israeli Air Force in Lebanon in the 2000s, and then increasingly the application of cyber capabilities to targeting currency and monetary power. And what I found is that actually counterfeiting is the most common weapon that's been either used or proposed. And everyone's done it, at least since the mid-1700s. William Pitt in England thought about doing it. Frederick the Great, Napoleon, they did it as well. Of course, the continental dollar was also counterfeited by the British for us. And then in the 20th century, this really took off. World War II, numerous cases of counterfeiting currencies was weaponized. And in the Middle East and Africa actually has experienced its own set of currency warfare episodes, including one of the most famous ones, which is the Suez conflict, which in 1956, Eisenhower targeted for manipulation the British pound in order to get the British to end its invasion of Egypt. But as far as other episodes, well, during the First World War, there was counterfeiting of the Ottoman currency by the British Secret Services, also the German African currency. In the Italian-Ethiopian War, the Italians, as they were invading Ethiopia, decreed that the Ethiopian currency was illegal and established their own Italian lira as a new currency in Ethiopia. And then, of course, there's also been other instances of counterfeiting, such as in Afghanistan during the 1980s. And so counterfeiting is actually a fairly common weapon. It's an odd weapon in some ways, because usually when we think of currency counterfeiting, we think of criminal elements producing them. It is somewhat of a unethical term, or an unethical weapon rather, from what I've seen in my archival research, but yet it's used quite frequently. And why is currency counterfeiting such a viable monetary weapon? Well, it's really easy to do. If you have, it's relatively, it's cost effective. It's fairly cheap to make fake currency. It's fairly easy to implement and distribute to the enemy's territory. And you can always be anonymous, right? You can always say, I didn't do it. But there are some costs to it. It does take time for the economic effects to play out. And again, there's this ethical question, and that comes up in one of the cases that I'm looking at that I'll get to here in a second. So anyway, so counterfeiting and currency warfare, it's a consistent feature of warfare. And so my research agenda is to try to figure out when and why this is used and what sort of motivates its use during war. This is overwhelmingly a form of warfare used by the military and special operations. Very seldom do folks in the financial world look forward to implementing any form of counterfeiting, or rather any type generally of currency warfare for the most part, and we can imagine why, right? Bankers are naturally susceptible to being afraid of forged currency circulating in their banks. So anyway, so my goal here is to figure out, well, what are those behavioral propositions that would explain when monetary power is used. And current existing literature doesn't really give us much to work with, at least from the international relations literature, the political economy literature, and the study of war has generally neglected this area of conflict. And so that's what I set out to do, to engage in at least some sort of theoretical explanation that will sort of give us a predictive aspect as to when currency warfare, in this case via counterfeiting, will occur. These are just some authors that go. So anyway, so my research question here: why do states contemplate implementing currency warfare via counterfeiting? And I have 3 cases that I am looking at, which again will be the Iran coup, the Persian Gulf War, and the ongoing crisis in Yemen. So what am I looking at here? My assumption here is that this isn't primarily an economic explanation. And by that I mean is to understand why and when currency warfare is implemented, we have to look at non-economic variables. The economics are the causal mechanism by which it causes or results in the political objective, but it's not the end in itself. And so what I'm looking at in this paper is how 2 specific variables help explain when counterfeiting is used as a weapon. The first one is the presence of a national security threat, and the second, which is what I find the most interesting, is what's the strategic motivation behind weaponizing counterfeit currencies. And what I've found is that in all 3 cases, as I found with all the cases I've been working with, the presence of that national security threat, whether it's almost in a context when the state might almost go to war or once they are at war, tends to result in a shift in the mindset of viewing counterfeiting as not just an unethical, illegal, or criminal enterprise, but as a viable weapon of war. And so that serves as a first mover, if you would, to begin the contemplation of this weapon. And the second one is a strategy of subversion. By that I mean, before we even get to considering what type of power we're going to use, the leaders that I have found first are motivated by this idea that, hey, we need to find a way to subvert the morale and the warfighting ability of the enemy. And how do you do that? Well, that's where currency warfare comes in. So, and we can get into sort of the relationship between identities and morale and finance and nation building and so forth in the Q&A. But anyway, so I argue that these 2 variables together are what explain when counterfeiting occurs in Middle Eastern conflicts. So how have I done this? Well, I've been looking at primary and secondary sources, both at for the Iranian coup. I've gone to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Fortunately, the George Washington University has a number of archival documents that I'm able to look for, which has been really helpful. And then secondary sources, either books published, which are minimal, but they're there. And then for the Yemen case, ongoing news reports and publications from the U.S. Treasury Department. So I don't know if you could. Okay, we can see it. So, just for the 3 cases. Most of these are fairly familiar, but let me see if I could put these contexts and see how the variables play out. So, 1953, Eisenhower is new to the White House. He is approached by the British, as we know, and they say, look, we have a problem in Iran. They have a new prime minister by the name of Mossadegh. And if he's not a communist, well, he's at least making it easier for the Soviets to gain presence in Iran, and they're also threatening our oil supplies. Eventually, within that mindset, Eisenhower agrees to begin to think about removing Mossadegh, and this is where that counterfeiting currency comes in. is what I found is that as part of the, and much of Operation Ajax remains classified, so who knows what more we could find later on, is that part of this suggestion in the memos written by the CIA officers is that, look, one way to destabilize the regime is to introduce these faked currency notes. And they link it to, again, we have to do this because of the Soviet presence, and then from a strategic perspective, it's a way of undermining the legitimacy of the Iranian prime minister at the time, right? The argument was, look, if we can create this monetary hardship, that's going to lead to a delegitimization of the regime in the eyes of the Iranian people. Now, it doesn't look, or at least I haven't found evidence that it was implemented, probably because, and we can get into sort of Eisenhower's history of counterfeiting during the Second World War, whether or not they thought it might take too long for it to actually work, or if Eisenhower some ethical reservations about it. I don't know, but at least for that case, the two variables seem to be present. Now, for the second case, the US-Iraq conflict. So, 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Within a week or two, the US begins to send troops to Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Desert Shield. Within that first wave of deployments, the 4th Psychological Operations Battalion gets sent to Saudi Arabia, and their task is to wage psychological warfare. And part of that was to create these counterfeited Iraqi dinars. Now, they were called counterfeit dinars, but they were probably more close to being sort of propaganda currency. So a currency that looks very similar to the legitimate currency, but with sort of psychological propaganda messages written in there. Officially, of course, the US is against counterfeiting. We don't do those things officially. But under the conditions of war, it was considered. And in fact, they were so good that many members of the coalition, especially the Arab members of the coalition, asked for us to not deploy these notes. Why? Because they were so good, they were worried that they would ultimately cause economic havoc in the region. Now, we end up doing it anyway, it looks like, once the war is over, in sort of our low intensity war with Saddam Hussein. And again, what I found is that the strategic motivation here was psychological, to undermine the morale, first of the Iraqi army, which looks like they were the first target of these currency notes, and in the broader sense, to destabilize the regime, either hopefully prompting either some form of coup against the regime, or for the people themselves to rise up against Saddam Hussein, with very bad consequences for the neighboring region. By that I mean the introduction of these counterfeit currencies did create some pretty harmful effects in the region, which again I can talk about later just for the sake of time. But again, the two conditions were there, right? Sort of motivated by this threat condition and then the strategy of subversion. Now to this, the third case, which is the Yemeni civil war, which is ongoing. So back in November 2017, the US government sanctioned the Iranian Revolutionary Guard for creating these Yemeni counterfeit currency. And we put more sanctions on them and so forth. But what's interesting, at least for me, was, well, does this fit the pattern of other instances in which counterfeiting was weaponized? Now, I don't have access to the Iranian high command or what their internal discourses. But at least from if I take a step back, these two variables seem to be present and consistent with how Iran is operating today. So for example, what would be the security threat in Yemen for Iran? Well, if we look sort of in the security perspective from the Iranians, many could argue that they view that they are being encircled either by the Saudis or the United States. And this is a way of fighting a proxy war as part of a forward defensive strategy. And in that sense, they have been supporting the Houthis, and I'm sorry, I know I'm butchering that name, trying to stabilize the Saudi-backed regime of the Hadi administration. And again, I apologize if I'm getting those names wrong. So it seems to be consistent with that. And again, when I look at sort of the history of counterfeiting as a weapon, it would lend even more credibility to this notion that this is what's motivating the Iranians. So those are the three cases that I have. Just for some concluding remarks, it looks like, at least in these three cases, these two variables that I'm working with tend to be present. It's very difficult to establish cause and effect, but I think I've been able to at least establish an element of congruence here. And so going forward, I hope to find a little bit more evidence so I can hopefully establish that cause and effect linking these two variables in conflicts in the Middle East. And so with that, I'll end it. Thank you.
You know, I got interested in the topic of Arab cultural warfare, the culture factor in Arab way of war. And I was at the American University of Beirut in the late 60s when the Fedayeen movement was really gaining a lot of popularity. It was the fashion at the time. And while most people were looking at the organization, the tactics, the strategy, the political implications, I was looking at the cultural aspects of this movement and Arab military in general. And over the years from that time, my interest in the cultural component of Arab warfare has remained constant. And I kept every scrap of paper, every article, and I maintained a fairly extensive file on the Arab way of war and the cultural aspects of it. I worked on the ground for about 5 years with the Jordanians and the Egyptians. I also had some time on the ground with the Lebanese, and through my contacts in the Iraqi community, I had a lot of interesting conversations with people who served with the Iraqis. And since I taught at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, my students were all over the place, and I got a lot of feedback from them. I also established a lot of contacts in the Arab world, and I have maintained contacts with them over the years, and they're an invaluable source of information. Well, in 1999, I wrote an article called Why Arabs Lose Wars for the Middle East Quarterly. It is one of the most visited articles that magazine since its founding has produced, which really surprised me because I thought any American advisor who'd spent time with the Arab armies would have pretty well figured out the same things that I did. But very few people write about cultural aspects of warfare. In fact, writing about culture itself is kind of a minefield, political minefield, because you're always afraid you're going to step on somebody's toes by unwanted criticism of some particular aspect of their culture. Well, it had a very long shelf life, that particular article. And basically, I said, this is the factors which render Arab conventional warfare generally ineffective. And I always quote it at this time, because it is a cultural minefield, that I never cast any aspersions on Arab intelligence or their courage. That's no nation, no people has an earmark on that. But it is, in fact, the culture. Well, a couple of years ago, I had a interview with Al Jazeera. The producer of the show came and said, you know, I haven't found any article or anything written about the Arab armies in the way that you have written it. Now, I'm no fan of Al Jazeera. I know who they represent. I know who pays them. I know what their viewpoint is. But nevertheless, I decided, yes, I'll do it. And because of it, I'm very happy that I did, because I got a lot of mail, messages, so forth, from former and some active Egyptian officers and enlisted men who said, yes, the show itself was called The Recruit. And it shows the barbarism, the total ineffectiveness of their NCOs, the way the enlisted men are treated in training. It was a hit piece on Egypt, no doubt about it. And I tried to put it in terms of this is about the Arab world, not about just Egypt. But, you know, Al Jazeera put it out, and I knew how they would edit it. But in any event, because of that, I was able to expand the number of contacts I had in the Egyptian military and a few from other Arab militaries as well. I continue to focus on Arab military culture, including I did an analysis of why the Arab is an unconventional fighter is much more effective than he is in the conventional warfare. And it's all cultural factors. And I'm not going to go into them, I don't have time, but I wrote this piece for the Maria online magazine, Barry Rubin's magazine. And I wrote it for a book that he edited. And I basically cataloged the cultural reasons that Arab as a guerrilla fighter, as an unconventional fighter, has always been much better, much more effective than he is in conventional warfare. And when you look at the cultural factors, it becomes pretty obvious why. So I go on to this paper, which was suggested that I write, and the article, Why Arabs Lose Wars, 20 years later. And basically, I looked at 3 countries. I looked at Egypt and their war in the Sinai, Saudi Arabia and the Gulfies and their war in Yemen, and Iraq and their war against the ISIS. Now to start with Iraq, I give the Iraqis a lot of credit. I'm not taking anything away from them. And the fact that they ejected the ISIS from the cities of Iraq and basically have regained a good part of their control. Not all of it, but most of it, okay? But you have to put it in context of what they had on their side. Total international support, American total air supremacy, all sorts of Western nations assisting them. And then finally, you have to understand that the Iraqis only used a minuscule part of their army in fighting the ISIS, the so-called Golden Division, the counterterrorism service, which by the time they reached Mosul, completely chewed up and decimated, because they really didn't have the trained troops or the discipline and the rest of their army to revitalize that unit. And to this day, I don't know if it has been revitalized. So what I'm saying basically is the same old problems of the Saddam era had been reintroduced into the Iraqi army when we left in 2006. We had only a very skeleton crew there, and most of the training that we had imparted to the Iraqis, and they were coming along, was lost. Because one of the things I have found in looking at why Arab armies really do not, well, let's put it this way. Western influence, Western training of Arab armies don't take. Why? Because we try to train them in a cultural framework of our culture, and it doesn't work. So as soon as we leave, that all goes away. And they revert to going back to doing things the way they always used to. Okay? Saudi Arabia, very moribund, fragmented command structure that it's always been there. The Saudi land forces, the National Guard, it's no accident they have 2 armies, because they're both there for balance to ensure that the regime stays in power. We have trained them since the 70s, but still for the most part you have to say the Saudis are pretty near incompetent. They have shown that in Yemen. They are unable to subdue the Houthi rebels. They're having the same problems that the Egyptians had in the 60s against the very same people. They haven't learned very much of anything. So we move on to the Egyptians. They have the same problem we had, and I know because I was one of them, in Vietnam. The Egyptian army has empowered these wide-ranging, large sweeps of the Sinai with thousands of troops involved. Well, the jihadis simply dug in, disappear into the villages, and they don't find anybody. The jihadis are very astute in how to attack the Egyptian army. They hit small units, because from the time that I remember, and from my own observations, the Egyptian army was very poor in small unit tactics and small unit leadership. Their officers certainly, simply great people, smart, could do wonders with a cell phone, but they simply were not up to standard on leading men in small unit actions. So you find the Sinai rebels hit checkpoints, they hit convoys, they hit where the Egyptian army is small, and they have done very well. Now the Egyptian tactics have been basically to attack the people rather than the jihadis, because it's the culture. Culture changed very slowly. We know that from de Tocqueville talking about United States in 1830. There's a lot of truth still in that. So culture changes very slowly, and the problem is still there. But one aspect has occurred, and that is the increasing Islamic radicalization, where people now are, you're Shia, but you're not Shia enough. You're Sunni, but you're not Sunni enough. You're a Muslim, but you're not Muslim enough. So we have this increasing radicalization and polarization of people in the Arab world, which of course affects their military force. I'm done.
So I realize why I'm on this panel, because obviously I'm dealing with military history. And when we want to study cohesion of coalitions, first we need to explain the term coalition and then cohesion. So coalition is not exactly an alliance. Coalition is usually during warfare, and it's not formal and it's not long lasting. It's about collaboration, cooperation between actors during the armed conflict in order to vanquish the enemy. Again, alliance is formal, it's long-lasting, it has aspects which are beyond military, and so on and so forth. So coalition is different from from an alliance. It's also, coalition is intended to include as many actors as possible in order to defeat the adversary. Cohesion. Cohesion, in my criteria, refers to two things, really. The size, how many actors are you actually able to bring on board, and how much effort are they really willing to put in? Are they willing to do each and every one of them as much as possible? Are they willing to coordinate? Are they willing, their strategies and their military moves? Are they willing to cooperate in terms of building force one to each other? Are they really sharing their innermost thoughts about how to defeat the adversary, how to better improve capacity of fighting? And I decided I'm going to look at the Middle East, because it seemed to me plausible that, at least seems very odd, in the Middle East we don't have really cohesive coalitions in comparison to Europe or the American experience. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I decided not to look at coalitions that were initiated by a great power from the outside, because that does not reflect the dynamics in the region. It reflects the degree to which that great power has tools of coercion to force people to come on board. So the Baghdad Pact, 1991 Gulf War, and the 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom, a global war on terror, are not included. I only look at the locals trying to build a cohesive coalition. And I look both at Cold Wars and conventional wars. By Cold Wars, I'm really referring to fighting wars of proxies and subversion. It's mainly when the two parties are not fighting each other militarily directly. That's a Cold War. When two parties are not fighting each other, they can support a proxy, they can fight a proxy, but they're not fighting directly. That's by definition a Cold War, because otherwise it would be hot. Gesundheit. So what's the record? I decided, in order to put things in perspective and also to gain some insight into why these things happen, why they're good or bad, cohesion, to look at Europe. The European experience, we have a lot of coalitions, and we have some variation, not as much as in the Middle East. We all know that during the Second World War, it took a lot of efforts for Britain to bring America on board, and America refused at first. Some say FDR didn't want to join in and let the British fight all the fighting, do all the fighting. Others say he was just constrained by public opinion. But the point is that once they got in, once they joined the war, there was an amazing collaboration. There was an amazing cooperation in all spheres. And the Axis powers, things are not as cohesive. Mussolini surprises Hitler time and time again, right? He goes into Greece, he goes into Yugoslavia, he goes into North Africa, surprises Hitler, and yet there seems to be more cooperation than in the Middle East. Now, what are the reasons that scholars give for collaboration in Europe, or lack thereof? Ideology, diplomacy, and interests, right? I mean, shared vision about the post-war order, level of threat, geography, that's all interests. Ideology, in the end of the day, allowed Britain and the US to collaborate as much as they did. And diplomacy, amazingly diplomacy. We have conferences like the Yalta Conference, where they actually discuss how the world is going to look like after the war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. People always talk badly about Sykes-Picot. It seems that the Middle East has not studied the real essence of Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot was wartime diplomacy. That's what you do in wars, a lot of diplomacy. And I'm trying to find the equivalent in the Middle East, and I couldn't. The real essence of Sykes-Picot were not found in the Middle East. And that shocked me. So let me talk a little bit now about the Middle East. So just to say things in a short way, the main lessons that I found about the Middle East is that the reasons why we don't have cooperation in the Middle East are threefold. One is huge competition over leadership. It's not that in the West we didn't have that, in the Western experience. The US did not like British Empire and so on, but it's not as much as in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the competition over leadership is intense. It's Saddam versus Assad. It's Nasser versus the Syrian Ba'ath regime. It's intense. The second thing is fears of mutual subversion. And a third thing is skill. Lack of diplomatic skill, lack of ability to create trust, lack of ability to think long-term, not just short-term. They deceive each other, they lie to each other, and since these leaders actually stay in power for long, they remember. They remember that they were cheated last time. They will not be cheated again. There is no cooperation. And they also remember that Israel was actually able to cooperate with them, was able to act as a status quo power. So the covert Israeli diplomacy works so well. And until the Middle East or the Arabs learn how to do diplomacy and skillful long-term diplomacy, they will lose. They will just lose. And so that's the main finding. Now I'm going to say a few words about, I hope I have time, but please cut me short 5 minutes before I'm done. I'm going to say a few words about the conventional wars and the degree of cohesion in them, and then something about the Cold Wars. So the conventional wars. Obviously, the October 73 war is the most cohesive coalition, really the most cohesive, because Saudi Arabia finally is willing to mix oil and politics together, right, and impose an oil embargo on the US. Syria fully cooperates. Jordan doesn't, but it has a good reason why not to. It lost all the West Bank. The downside of 73, Egyptian unwillingness to exploit its momentum in the early days, and getting out of the SEM missiles, batteries, protection, except for the offensive on the 8th day of the war. Except for that, it's doing nothing to help the Syrians. So why are things going so well in the October 73 war? First and foremost is trust. And secondly, deception about war goals. So trust because Bakr and Assad could actually trust each other. Saddam and Assad, of course, would not get along, and they would try to kill each other more than once. But Bakr and Assad actually got along. The second thing is Sadat, unlike Nasser, didn't try to topple everyone. And so he could create more trust in him and his goals in the war. He was able to deceive the Syrians about the real goals of the war because of his ingenuity of strategy of limited war, which he lied about to Assad. But then again, it's part of strategizing, part of the skill that he had. Now, of course, the fact that Jordan was cheated last time, the fact that Nasser lied to Jordan and told Jordan, we defeated all the Israeli Air Force, meant that Jordan this time was not taking any chances. It was siding with Israel. It was warning Israel there's going to be a surprise attack. So we see the skill really, really mattered in 73. It mattered in making the Jordanians not be part of the coalition really effectively, and making, on the other hand, the others collaborate. The Saudis did cooperate because of political developments inside Saudi Arabia. A lot of concern about Jerusalem after 67. Suddenly Jerusalem is a major issue, and the Saudis, who are religious Islamists, cannot ignore Jerusalem, even nationalism at the time. But we see skill as a major factor. The other war, which ranks really high in terms of coalition cohesion, is 67. But 67 is it's a partnership of the free riders. They're all forced to join, but none of them really wants to work and do the hard work. So yes, it's in terms of size, it's impressive. I mean, Nasser is able to bring everyone on board, but the Syrians are doing nothing during the war, really nothing. And they believe they can lie to their own people about doing something, and that's why they don't have to do anything for domestic reasons. Of course, the Syrians want to see also Nasser defeated, competition over leadership. But what's shocking is that really they didn't really discuss their long-term goals. What are the goals after the war? How could we really make advancement? And lying throughout the war, which didn't help. The third one is the anti-Iranian coalition. The anti-Iranian coalition actually was not bad. The Saudis were willing to pay the money. The Egyptians were bringing people to work instead of the Iraqis going to the front. Jordan was joining the Iraqis, and the Israelis were letting actually weapons move through the port of Eilat and Aqaba to Saddam Hussein. And again, there's a joint enemy which explains it all. But I also think that Saddam Hussein is in his finest moment here. He knows how to reassure the Jordanians, we will never subvert against you. Assad was seen throughout the 70s as someone who was willing to kill anyone, and such a bully that everyone was willing to join Saddam. I know we have a different image of Saddam, but really, again, skill really matters in the anti-Iranian coalition. Finally, the 48 war. What can I say? I mean, that's the backstabbing that took place during that war. The lack of coordination is amazing. I mean, Avi Schleim writes about it, and he's right. And at the same time, the Israelis were very, very skillful in splitting that coalition. To begin with, Abdallah was not, the leader of the coalition, who was Abdallah, was not really acting as a leader in a true sense. He was trying to make a deal with the Israelis so the Egyptians would have to make the armistice agreement first, rather than him. But everyone was backstabbing the other, and it seemed that the leaders did not really come to terms with the fact that we have to be with each other for long now, and let's try to discuss how we're going to go about it. Each state was trying to get its grab at Palestine and have its share, and that's it. And again, no vision about how to coordinate a strategy. The Cold War coalitions, well, we have the anti-Nasser coalition, which again shows the Israeli skill of the Mossad in forming connections with Morocco and sharing sensitive intelligence, of course. The Shah, intervention in Yemen by the Jordanians and the Saudis. Overall, I think diplomacy again plays a role. It's not just realism. The Iranian-led coalition since 2003, Iran is good in subversion. So I'm not sure it's even a coalition as much as ability to control different states. And the Saudis are not good in disciplining. The Saudis are just 3 minutes. The Saudis are trying to discipline Hariri. They're trying to discipline other actors like Qatar, but they're not successful. Yes, Turkey is not playing along, but the Saudis are not seen as a benevolent leader that everyone wants to have in this region. Sadat, again, was seen as wataniya, not qawmiya. Sadat was seen as someone who would be willing to let free and live and let live kind of person. I'm not Nasser. And people were okay with that in the region, I mean, other leaders. And the Saudis are not reassuring in that respect. They're too dominating. They're too aggressive in their leadership style. Nasser, of course, had a good coalition, and yeah, that's it. So I'm going to conclude by saying that it's fear of subversion that really matters, but what's fascinating about the Middle East in comparison to the Western experience, and it's not that cohesion in the West was perfect. It never was. FDR tried to exploit Churchill and let the British do all the work, and so on and so forth. But there was at least this notion that states are going to have to live with each other for long, and therefore we have to do things diplomatically. We have to talk to each other. And again, the Middle East just doesn't have this tradition of knowing how to live with each other and agree with each other prior to going to war. It's really odd because the militaries would actually meet and the commanders would meet, but not the politicians prior to wars, in really deciding how we go about and what's the vision after the war, realistically speaking. Partly because nobody could admit that we don't want the destruction of Israel. Nobody could admit we don't really want the Palestinians to win. We want Palestinian nationalism gone. Partly because certain things they could not admit, but they still, in covert diplomacy, they could have agreed on things like the French and British did in Sykes-Picot. So my bottom line is the Sykes-Picot lessons were not really understood in the Middle East. Thank you.
So mine's the oddball paper. I'm more interested in the effects of war, and even more particularly what the people of the region think about these effects of war. I started this research about 3 years ago, and I have to mention that I got a generous grant from the International Institute for Islamic Thought and also support from the Arab Institute in Doha to do some of the research in Jordan, later in Lebanon, actually Jordan for 3 years in a row, but also Qatar and Saudi Arabia in the past couple of years. And I realized as I was thinking about this that my wife and I, who will be talking tomorrow, we spent a lot of time in Kuwait teaching at AUC during the time that the funding was being raised for the brigades in Syria. And we were also in Qatar in the summer of 2013 when you could see billboard-size advertisements trying to get people to give money to what was called at the time the Syrian opposition or the Syrian resistance. This is a very broad topic, and I think it's going to turn out to be something much bigger than I can talk about today. So I wanted to try to focus it more particularly on the idea of what do we think we should do when there are refugees? What do we think from a Western perspective, and what do Muslims think? So you might all be familiar with the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. It's a doctrine that was first drawn up by the UN International Commission on Intervention of State Sovereignty. That was in 2001. And Gareth Evans is really strongly involved in a lot of this. So this was during the time of the Rwanda, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Somalia that they started to think about what are reasons to intervene and violate someone else's state sovereignty. In 2005, and I took this language directly from the UN agreement to which all member states ratified that, you can note that there are 4 conditions under which the responsibility to protect pertains, so genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And then I took the other important statement there that we can take collective action when nations' authorities manifestly fail to protect their own population. So the idea is that if a country doesn't protect its own population, that the rest of the world can intervene and then protect those people for them because they might not be doing that. In 2011, this was the first time that it's short, R2P is short for responsibility to protect, but it's the first time the doctrine was invoked. This language, again, is a quote from the UN findings. The only thing I did is I changed the way they spelled Gaddafi's name. But the Gaddafi's regime was thought to be on the brink of executing genocide or ethnic cleansing or committing crimes against humanity. So all of these things that were part of the trigger the responsibility to protect. And so the intervention of eventually of NATO forces was backed by that justification. So in 2012, we have a different response. So in 2012, I just put some of the facts up there. You probably are all very familiar with the situation in Syria. One thing I just discovered this morning is a recent poll was done in Lebanon and in Jordan among refugees, and they were asked, these are Syrian refugees, well, have you ever been intimidated? Do you feel harassed living? And so 75% of the refugees in Lebanon responded that they do feel that they're being treated unfairly as guests in Lebanon, and about 50% in Jordan. But to date, there was this responsibility to protect was not invoked. So when President Obama gave his speech in 2014, he used different language than this to talk about the conflict with the Islamic State. So these are just some images. We're talking about 6 million refugees roughly outside of Syria, and about 6 million people within Syria internally displaced. One of the things I really do want to do eventually is to also talk about Yemen, because Yemen is a huge humanitarian disaster right now as well. So the question I want to ask is this: is there an Islamic version of the responsibility to protect? And because I only have about 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about three different. So the answer is yes, and I want to say there are three different ways of looking at this responsibility to protect. So the first one I'll talk about, we might want to characterize as integrationalist. So these are Muslim thinkers who say that we want to integrate our Muslim values into the world community and participate with the world community in trying to protect not only Muslims but other people around the world. Then we'll talk a little bit about what we might call a civilizationalist approach, the idea of establishing a Muslim homeland or a Muslim community, the Ummah, that would protect Muslims primarily. And then finally, what we might characterize, well, I have characterized before, as a death cult, the Islamic State, and their approach to this responsibility to protect. And if we have time, I have a video that I want to show at the end that kind of, I think, illustrates well the Islamic State's position on this. So let me briefly talk about each one of these three, and then afterwards, if there's questions, I can go into more detail. So the concept of maqasid al-sharia is an Islamic legal theory, and the theory had been promoted by a number of scholars throughout the year, mostly in the 1960s, the 1970s. Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, says that the production of masalih, or benefits, and the repelling of harm and corruption are all part of Islamic law. And this goes back to classical sources as well. So some of these people reference Ghazali, for example, or Ibn Taymiyyah. But it's basically a movement that's begun in the 1970s. And probably the champion of it now is the person who I put here, Kamali, who's a Malaysian scholar. He spent a lot of time in Afghanistan as a Qadi and a legal scholar, and now he's teaching again in Malaysia. So Kamali has probably done the most thorough work on this. And he divides, so the word maqasid means benefits or goals. So the idea is that behind Islamic law, behind the Sharia, are a number of goals. And what these goals are what Sharia is supposed to produce. When it's implemented, it's supposed to produce these things. And rather than give you a long explanation of the theory, let me just explain briefly that Kamali divides them into three different types. So there's the primary ones, which is the ones you see here, the masalih dawariya, and then there's two other types underneath that. And each one has a certain number of principles. So these are the 5 principles that most of the maqasid scholars agree on. Now there were a couple of other principles that I wanted to give you as well. So Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, adds to this list justice and freedom. An-Najjar adds protection of the environment. And Kamali himself adds world peace, economic development, and scientific research. So these are all things that Islamic law is supposed to supposed to produce. So, for example, if faith is one of the things that Islamic law is supposed to protect and produce, so the idea would be, okay, well, jihad protects religion, and so the purpose of jihad is the protection of religion. So that you would understand why you would perform that particular ritual. Also, the Islamic law is supposed to have broad general benefits. So one that Kamali talks about is that Islamic law encourages work and commerce with the aim of enabling every individual to achieve their full potential in society. So therefore, you would want to make sure that the laws are consistent with that. So more specifically, there are a number of mostly Southeast Asian scholars. So Arafat Shukriya is one of them. He's in Malaysia, but there's a number of scholars in Singapore and also in Singapore and Malaysia. Maybe those are the two places I was thinking of. I was thinking of Indonesia, but I can't think of any names off the top of my head, who specifically focus on the notion of forced migration. So if you think about it, anybody who's taken kind of the Introduction to Islam class knows that Hijrah is very important, right? Because the calendar, the Muslim calendar, is a Hijri calendar. It's dated from the time that the Prophet Muhammad was forced to migrate to another location. There are two migrations that he and his followers have to engage in. The first one he didn't go on, which was to Ethiopia, and there's all sorts of stories in Islamic texts about how welcoming the Ethiopians were and how they should receive special treatment. In fact, later in Islamic law, it says Muslims can never invade Ethiopia and try to convert the Ethiopians because they're protected, because of what they did to the Muslims at the beginning of Islam. So you might also be familiar with the concept Dar al-Islam. So the forerunner to that term was Dar al-Hijrah, right? This was the abode of Hijrah. It's the place to which people make emigration. And we probably all are familiar with the idea that orphans are very important in Islam and the protection of orphans. The Prophet Muhammad himself was an orphan. So all of these things are excavated, you could say, by these Maqasid scholars to argue that the protection of refugees and keeping refugees from occurring is in fact an Islamic obligation, so that Muslims have a responsibility to protect refugees and to try to keep the refugees from occurring in the first place. So the second example I want to look at is what we would call traditional Islamist discourse. And I want to divide it into three parts. So the traditional Islamist discourse is pretty straightforward. I'm fortunate that my wife and I have been teaching a course on political Islam at the Naval Academy for a couple of years. So we're able to read through a lot of these texts with the students, and you get a lot of insight and clarity that you wouldn't get reading them on your own. And I'm not going to read all of these things to you. You can read them yourself if you like while it's up there. But the first point in the Islamist discourse is that there is no Muslim community today. And we may think, well, that's crazy. There's Muslims everywhere. But you could just read, for example, the words of Sayyid Qutb, and he says that the Muslim community has not existed for many centuries. So the idea is that the Ummah, the true Muslim community, is lost and that we need to reestablish it. This particular verse from the Quran that I have cited at the top of this is really the most important verse to illustrate this kind of Islamist, the Islamist goal in raising this new community, right? Let there be from among you a community, an ummah, calling for what is good, ensuring what is known as right, protecting against what is known as wrong. I mean, this sounds a lot like the responsibility to protect language, and the Muslims recognize that in their discourse. So the reason that you need to raise the Muslim community now is that the world is facing a crisis. So I just put up three different examples today. So Hassan al-Banna, when he was writing, of course, this was the time of the Great Depression. And he thought that the world was going to be destroyed, right? And we're talking about the rise of fascism, and the world needed to be saved. Sayyid Qutb starts off by basically talking about the Cold War, right? Humanity today is not only standing at the brink of an abyss because of the threat of annihilation, right? Nuclear war that could destroy the entire world. So there's a crisis that has to occur, and clearly the refugee crisis is one that would spark the need for establishing the Muslim community. And so finally, how do you do this? You do it by establishing a vanguard, right? A group of people who are out in front. And again, this verse is the most important verse for that, right? Then God will bring a people whom he loves and who love him, humble toward believers and powerful against unbelievers, striving in the way of God, of course, jihad fi sabilillah, and fearing not the reproach of any reproacher. That is the bounty of God, which he brings to whom he will. So the language, again, is one of we have been raised up, we've been called by God in order to protect the rest of the Muslim community, in order to save the world from annihilation. And so finally, the goal of all this is the establishment of the Islamic State, right? And so in this case, I'm not talking about the specific Islamic State that we'll get to in a minute, but an Islamic State. And so I put a couple up there, but you can see that Khomeini's language almost directly ties in with the other discourse that we've looked at, right? No one can say it's no longer necessary to defend the frontiers and the territorial integrity of the Islamic homeland. And if you skip down, he says, any person who claims that the formation of an Islamic government is not necessary implicitly denies the necessity for the implementation of Islamic law, the universality and comprehensiveness of that law, and the eternal validity of faith itself. So he's basically saying if you don't accept the need to establish an Islamic State, you're not a Muslim, because that's required of all Muslims, this political engagement. So let me turn to the third example, and I will illustrate this example most clearly with a video at the end. But one of the things about the Islamic State that is good for using it as an example is that they're in a big hurry and they make things really simple. So I don't have a lot of time left if I want to show the video, but let me just explain their basic formula, and I've got it up there right now. So this is their guidebook. You can go and get a PDF online anywhere. And I've called it the Let's Go Guide to Joining the Islamic State. So I don't know, most people don't understand. I'm glad some people still understand that, right? You know, there were these travel guides that are like, let's go to Europe, you know, let's do this. And it's actually what can I say? I don't want to be inappropriate, but it's actually funny if you read through the book. So there's one page where it says, when you're applying for a visa to go to Syria, Turkey, right? Because you want to sneak into Syria, make sure you mark the box that you're going on tourism, not the one that says I'm going to Syria for jihad, right? So the whole book is meant as a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of approach, and I think we might see some of that in the video as well. So the idea of hijrah, of emigration to the Islamic State, is, as Khomeini said, it's a requirement. So again, I had examples which would be in the larger paper, which I do plan on publishing, where the Islamic State argues that if you don't come and join us, that you're not a Muslim. You have to come and join us, and the reason that you want to join us is because we will protect you, right? We are establishing the Muslim community that's going to protect the Muslim community. And how are we going to save the world? Well, if you think about it, I'm sure the Islamic State soldiers know that they're probably not going to defeat the United States, and also the United States and Iran and Turkey and everybody else. So what's their only hope? Well, you make hijrah to the Islamic State, you engage in jihad, and what's the purpose of jihad? Getting killed in battle. And once enough of them get killed, then the world will end. And Jesus will return, and he'll raise them all from the dead, and the zombie army will defeat everybody except for the righteous. And that'll be it.
Thanks, gentlemen.
That was great. Thank you.